Liberate your imagination. Liberate your imagination. Liberate your imagination. Liberate your imagination. Okay. Oh my gosh. So I'm a little bit nervous, Aphiwe, because, like I said, I'm reprising my podcast.
Do it.
Okay, so hi everybody, and welcome to the Ellipsis podcast. And essentially, the podcast is all about us going back into the past, but also reflecting on the present, because of course the present is a gift of the past. And most importantly, trying to pave a way for the future, because I believe the future is created by the solutions that we come up with in the present. And I believe that, especially as Black people, my people, we need to expand our imagination to create a future that is more favorable to us, that continues to uplift us and helps us see a better day, because right now kushubile. And on this episode, I am so excited to be talking to Aphiwe Mame. We'll get into who she is right now, but yeah, let's get into it. Hi, Aphiwe.
Hi there, Lerato. Thanks for having me.
How are you?
All good, all good. A little bit too early, but all good. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm all right. So I was actually reading up on you because, of course, we met up on the wholesome Twitter, not the bad X. And so from here, I was just reading that you are, well, from your LinkedIn, I got you are a mixed methods media and social impact practitioner with experience across audience research, strategic communications, and digital content in South Africa. But you also go on to say that you are a radio kid. So before we get into the whole podcast, I want us to get to know you and your background and experience in the media industry in this country.
Oh my goodness, that little gory past of mine when I was a struggling journalist. Oh my. Yeah, so Radio Kid, oh my goodness, where do I even start? So I've been on radio for quite some time. I want to say a good 13 years before all of the new mixed method things were happening later on. And in fact, had you told me back then that I would even be writing and doing all of the work that I'm currently doing, I would have laughed in your face because I knew that I wanted to be the next Reedy Tlabi, and that was the goal, that was the wish, the vision. And yeah, so I started out, in fact, on community radio. So in Makanda at Rhodes University, Rhodes Music Radio, that those were my beginnings and my love for media. But I mean, to rewind a little bit back, my love for media really started from watching a lot of SABC One, like most 90s kids. And of course, there were continuity presenters and the Lala Hiriamas of the day. I think I kind of knew that whatever was happening in that little small box, I wanted to do it. So, in fact, my love for media starts with TV because, of course, this is in Makanda and there aren't a lot of television opportunities. I then sort of try to figure out how am I going to end up somewhere in media, and Rhodes Music Radio becomes my home. So I start out in high school. So I started when I was in grade 9, going on to grade 10. So I started broadcasting in grade 9. There was a kids show. There was like a show for high school kids. It used to happen in the weekends. It was like a breakfast show. And I started being a co-presenter there. And then, I mean, I spent all of my high school there going into university. So I'm a radio kid because my love and my training happened on student broadcasting. And yeah, that was really what shaped the way I thought about media, how I came to love creating stories and telling stories. It was my 13 years at Rhodes Music Radio, starting in high school, university, moving to Cape Town, and then every time I'd move back to Makanda, they would always have a place for me I mean, I went from being a young high school presenter all the way up to deputy programming manager, which is insane.
Whoa. That's insane. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's my little, yeah, a little bit of my history with, where the beginnings of loving media and broadcasting started.
Oh, wow. I don't think we talk and appreciate enough of like what the SABC showed to us growing up and how we were able to see ourselves, because I don't think the younger kids of today are or have ever really seen themselves through presenting, even through loving radio. I will say that I came to love radio much later in my life, like about 2014, you know. And funny enough, I loved it through like talk radio. I guess maybe I was just that girl that was into politics. And so I became like, I had a radio. Imagine 2015, I was listening to radio in my res room, your Power FMs, your Kaya FMs. Like that was my jam, But I think we're going to get straight into it.
Sure.
I thought I should give the hot takes because I don't want to put my guests on the spot like that. But really, in conjunction to what we were just talking about right now with representation, I really do think, and this is my hot take of this episode, that middle class Black people are centered a little bit too much for comfort in what we see as South African media today. I think it's across radio and even digital content. Okay, maybe digital content is a little bit more democratized, but through film and television, we are seeing one story. And I think it's very dangerous because then there's only one story to tell about a Black South African when we are so incredibly diverse, in our makings, the communities that we have, the languages that we have, even the dialects of the languages that we have. I think we are letting them fall away. And I think it's very much a thing of us trying to run away from the apartheid story. So we don't want to see poverty. We don't want to see Black people in discomfort. However, we're very comfortable seeing Black criminals, which is quite problematic. But yeah, what's your take on that? Since you study the thing, I'm just a viewer, even though I do work in radio. But at the end of the day, I am just a viewer.
Yeah, hot take a Bandai, as the kids would say on TikTok.
Yeah.
Look, I agree with a little bit of a caveat, just to play the devil's advocate, and really, but I definitely agree. My caveat is that it's not that the middle class Black stories don't deserve space. And I think you're right in saying
True.
that we have quite a lot of stories to tell as South Africans. But I think where the issue becomes is that, the stories become the default Black experience on TV. And that tends to sort of flatten the reality of Black life in South Africa. And I think any intersection or any conversation that I come into where we're talking about media, as you probably know, Lerato, most of my work sort of examines a lot of, media from the late 90s, 2000s, and early 2010s. And I choose those specific three areas because I believe that's where a lot of the South African DNA in terms of making television was at its most peak and most creative and most dynamic. And so what you found during those three periods is that for some odd reason, I mean, not so much odd, but there was the recipe for making television was quite diverse. So you had your generations that comes in the late 90s that does speak, to the emerging middle class Blackness on television, which I think was important for the time. It was aspirational. It was respectable, it was safe, it was non-threatening, and I think it was great. And then the 2000s come in, and then we start seeing a little bit of diversity. And I mean, of course, we have Yizo Yizo, we have Soul City, we have these stories that are sort of challenging Gazlam. We have these stories that are challenging this idea that we are this, myopic, or we don't have duality, right? And then we
Mm.
sort of start seeing nuanced stories being told on television, but also being told with care, which is very important, because I think oftentimes when we talk about representation and diversity, when it comes to media just in general, I don't think we often extend the conversation to also being very careful in how we tell those stories, because again, we run the risk of course, perpetrating stereotypes, and creating quite problematic, again, narrow views about who we are. So I do think that, the late 90s, 2000s, all the way up until the early 2010s, we did see quite a nice diverse palette in terms of how blackness was represented on South African television. And then something happens as we're going into the mid 2010s, and like now this is 2014, 2015, and then the change, I don't know where and how, but something
Mm.
happens on television screens where the what do you call it? The aesthetics suddenly just becomes one, right? And that's where
Mm.
the middle black class experience sort of becomes the only sort of lens that we are able to articulate Black experience on television or on any media platform. And then the conversation starts narrowing. And the problem with that is, as that's happening with local television, platforms are starting to grow, like your Netflix and all of these other, streaming platforms. What then happens is, by the time we get into the 2020s, because we're bringing in new logics, and of course, we talk about my current paper that I'm working on, which is doing a comparative analysis between Yizo Yizo and Blood and Water. I talk about platform logics, where suddenly even South African experiences can no longer just be truly South African. They have to be
Mm.
exported to the global world. And so what Blood and Water represents essentially is like a Gossip Girl version of what the global world would think
Yeah.
looks like in South Africa. And of course, when you look at Netflix and the high school stories there's a certain level of this global aesthetic that exists, that's not necessarily localized. And in all other countries, whether it's South America, um, you know, it always almost sort of follows this very Hollywood DNA of creating stories. So that's where the issue for me is that I think it becomes default, and then we
Mm.
lack this nuanced and very messy way of telling stories, which I think, and by messy I really just mean there's much more to work with than just one template of how to tell these stories. And I think it also does make it easier for broadcasters and advertisers, because essentially it's much more safe and it's respectable and it's aspirational, so it's much more easier to package. So yeah, that's the long and short of me agreeing with that. I do think that, middle class Black experiences do get to enjoy a little bit more
Mm.
comes to television and media in general.
Oh, you brought up so many points there that I'll try not to like. We're trying not to make this like a 3-hour podcast, but um, woo, where do I start? Okay, let me just center on this one point.
Yeah.
I was cringing when they were marketing youngins. I think it was Youngins, I'm not sure. And they
Mhm.
were calling it the new age Yizo Yizo. I said, oh my gosh, shut up your mouth, because what are you talking about? And I feel like in today's, even the social commentary, we want to um compare people to icons just because they did a small little thing, just for
Mhm.
existing. Because you're this young person existing now, you can compare yourself to this person that, of course, existed, but existed with so much, I don't know, man, background story, so much feistiness. It was not just them doing, now actually. Waiting, let me not do this rant here. But I completely get what you say. And I want to ask you this. It's a very controversial subject, but do you think that we are also seeing that collapse in that, or that this one story pushed because of the collapse of the SABC? Do you think that is something that affected how we do tell stories? Because with my understanding is that the public broadcaster had the responsibility to tell all stories, or a lot of stories, because they need to show South Africans, whereas private media, like, they can tell whatever story that they want to tell because it's their money, and they don't actually have social responsibility.
Yeah, yeah. Look, I think the change of management and the different changes of management that have happened over the years at the SABC have seen different sort of perspectives in terms of what it means to tell stories via the public platform. And I think that has, in some instances created a decline, and in some instances we saw a little bit of rejuvenation. Definitely, I think because of a lot of changes rather in management, there has been a sort of slowdown in terms of what we were used to in terms of like the stories that were being told. And of course, when you have commissioning editors that are not plugged on what's happening on the ground in terms of storytelling, you then have this distance between what the audience longs for and what the audience is used to with what gets translated on television. So I think where we need investment, one is in commissioning editors that are able to do thorough research in terms of how do we tell stories, right, holistically, in ways that are going to enrich the people that are watching the stories, and in ways that are going to critically engage, the people of South Africa. So I do think that over the years, because, management has changed at the SABC, the perspective of what storytelling looks like has also changed. And unfortunately, to some degree, not for the best. I think there are moments where you're like, okay, there is an attempt, but I think the investment isn't entirely 100%. And so, of course, what then ends up happening with what we are watching as viewers is that we end up with incomplete stories, because there's an incomplete process that's happening behind the scenes, or there is lack of investment and interest in investing in stories that are critical and that are quite, important. And also, as you mentioned, because in the beginning, especially late 90s, going into the Rainbow Nation in the 2000s, what was also happening was the television became part of the nation building project. It wasn't just an
Mm.
add-on. It wasn't, and that's why I said the other day on Twitter that I always reference specifically the 2000s as the nation building renaissance, because
Mm.
for me, the mandate wasn't only just to tell good stories, but it was also part of nation building. And I don't think nation building stops when we feel that, oh, we've arrived. I think what we see with with America, what with the UK, with the bigger television landscape, so that nation building continues to be the backbone of
Yeah.
storytelling. So the way that Americans tell their stories, and of course there are a lot of problems there, even with the minorities not being included and lack of representation. But generally, when you think about, I'll say, whiteness, and how whiteness is generally across Europe and America and North America, the way their stories are told, there's
Mhm.
depth, there's investment, there is history, there is contemporary takes on what it means to be this and that. You
Mm.
don't get to enjoy that. And one can argue, obviously, within the Western countries, that of course that there isn't really much investment when it comes to minority stories. But here at home, because we are the majority, that means that there's an incomplete process, or there's an incomplete journey, um, that is that someone somewhere clearly is not entirely invested in completing that journey,
Mm.
making, at least, and making it whole. That we are back in a place where we're able to tell full and nuanced stories that are interested in engaging who we are as Black people in South Africa. So I do think that the changes again have created this, I don't know, this weird or strange sort of distance between the importance rather of storytelling and where the public broadcaster sits within that importance. And so I think because I don't believe that nation building is something that can just be achieved, I think it's an ongoing thing. I think when we thought that, oh, we've done all that we could, okay, now let's just be hip and happening. And of course, I think, as you know, if you're old enough to have been a teenager in the early 2010s, that's when really things were starting to shift, because the entrance of Vuzu meant that the SABC had to sit up, right, and it had to compete, because I think again the logics were changing at the time, and of course globally we were seeing this more street and more grittier way of telling stories, and of course young people were the front and center, and I think Vuzu emulated that quite well.
Definitely.
And as you say, it's a private owned entity. And it's quite interesting because as private owned as it was still very much so interested in telling quite critical stories of Blackness, specifically young urban Blackness, because I think that is the time when media convergence is happening. And for the first time, we're seeing digital, starting to Uzu shows were on YouTube in a time where we were not really on. This is like freaking 2010, and we're not even having those kind of conversations. But they're starting to flirt with media convergence. Channel O, specifically South Africa, is starting to really engage with media convergence on that level. And I think what should have happened in the 2010s was that I think the SABC should have started really investing in how do I keep up with the times and ask that question, because I think what happened also is that the SABC kind of got left behind. And so it's
Definitely.
constantly sort of playing catch up. And so you can't play catch up and also be able to tell good stories at the same time, because one is going to suffer,
Yeah.
right? And unfortunately, the storytelling component of the SABC tends to suffer at the pursuit of wanting to be sleek and cutting edge and wanting to keep up with the times. So I do think again investment is something that has gone awry within the SABC, and I think that also comes with just priorities and what is prioritized. And I don't think at the moment the kind of storytelling that we saw in the late 90s, 2000s, 2010s is something that's a priority. I think we're chasing numbers, and I think we're chasing exportable logics, because we want stories that are going to be able to be watched by people that are not necessarily South Africans. And I don't know if that's a good thing from a public broadcaster standpoint.
Heavy on that investment, hey? When you compare CakeNet and Mzansi Magic, heavy on that investment. But you have authored a chapter, am I right?
Yes.
Please tell us about it, because this is such important work. Because as someone that works in media, when we are doing research just on even music, like I remember we had a segment that we had started called Then versus Now. So we wanted to take old or new songs that have sampled old South African songs and finding information on just a Bujo Mujo. Oh, my goodness. I'm surely Puri to you, you're going to find one sentence about her and that's it. So, please tell us about 50 years of South African television and how you came about writing that chapter.
Yeah. Before I get into that, let me touch on what you just spoke on about the difficulty of accessing information. And because that's where my story starts, in fact, before we even get to 50 years of television in South Africa, and the work I sort of start pursuing in, I think I started 4 years ago, but really the journey for me began in 2014. I had this little book that I used to just write notes on. And in fact, that little book was a journal of mine in high school. And I remember, because I started jotting down these ideas in high school, and I remember I was watching well, I used to watch a lot of Ugly Betty in the 2010s, early 2010s. So when Ugly Betty came out on ABC, American television show, I think most people know it. I was very struck because, again, we know Hollywood to be such a very touch and go space when it comes to representation. But here we had this, brown family that was front and center. We had a lot of queer storylines, and all of these, a lot of things were happening, and it was also written and directed and produced by a queer person. So there was quite a lot of interesting things that were happening around Ugly Betty. And I remember by the time I got to university at Rhodes, I stumbled upon a journal that was essentially doing the work that I'm doing now, and it was sort of explaining the importance and what Ugly Betty, what that moment meant for television in America at the time. And I remember thinking, I don't know of anyone who has done similar work that almost looks at the different moments and what these moments meant for television in South Africa. That was one. But then the more I tried to look for information, I tend to sort of stumble upon the same issue that you mentioned, that it was just these one sentences. If anything existed at all. And then it would also be these broken websites where there used to be some kind of archive, but it's at the mercy of whoever ran the server, which is now bringing me closer to 50 years of television in South Africa. The issue that I'm constantly trying to talk about on Twitter as well is that we don't have formalized institutions that are archiving pop culture in South Africa. And so
True.
what happens is that a lot of the stuff that has happened over the years becomes word of mouth, and the custodians of that information obviously grow older, they pass away, and that information is not passed down. And so what we end up having is then sort of living off these stories that you hear when people go and do podcast interviews today or radio interviews back in the day. The fact that I can't even find an actual formal, write up on what it meant to have Aus Penny Libiane to be, she's literally the foundation for pop culture reporting in South Africa, because she, in fact, her show on Metro FM was the actual show that started or even was doing something that looked like media convergence at that time in the 90s,
Wow.
right? But there isn't anything written about that. You hear about that by chance when you're listening to podcasts or when you're listening to radio interviews. And so, what does that mean then for the next generation who wants to do similar work but don't have these blueprints or don't even know that this thing has been done before? And so I started, doing these threads online. And then before the threads, in fact, I went back to this book and I was like, oh, I remember the first two things that I had written about was Home Affairs and Mzunes and Zizwa. And I remember, and I wrote this in high school. So, because I remember this was grade 11 and for Mzunes and Zizwa, I remember I put a note about what does this mean about masculinities. And then I remember
Sure.
for Home Affairs, I put a note on, oh, this is interesting. This is an interesting way of exploring womanhood in South Africa. And I left it at that. It was just that. It was just the two titles and in brackets, those two thoughts that I'd left there in my journal. I found it by chance when I got to university and I was like, what was I even trying to say here? And then I remember as I was stumbling upon these journals, sort of exploring television, I was like, let me do something. Then I drafted my first sort of blog-like, text about Mzunes and Zizwa and the exploration of different masculinities in South Africa. And then again, I left it because also something to note here, listener, I don't consider myself to be a writer.
Yeah.
I majored in broadcasting. So I was lazy. I said, girl, I'm not about to write. I'm not about that life. It's too long. It's too taxing. It's easier for me to tell stories via broadcasting. And that was just my life. And so I majored in radio and television. And that was that. I never looked back. And then it came back again and I was rewatching Ugly Betty and I said, you know what, this thing is not leaving me. Like something keeps on saying like, you need to do something about this. And so then I started with the thread and then I started writing it. And then at the time when I was writing it, I think 2 years, if not 3 years ago, LinkedIn introduced LinkedIn articles. And then I said, let me see, and let me just write this thing. And I remember I wrote it and then I shared it as a by the way on Twitter. And then it just
It took
obviously
off.
blossomed. into its own thing. So how I come into the 50 years of television with all of that story is I was now wanting to formalize this.
Mm.
And a lecturer of mine who taught me radio, was working on research, and she had asked me to become to work on one of the projects that she was doing, and it was really about archiving the Black press in South Africa. And I was really just like, oh my goodness, like this is actually interesting. And I think from reading up on so many, newspapers that were really centered around Black life experience. And in fact, by the way, this issue, back to that hot take of yours about Black middle class Black experiences being centered way too much. Even back then, even in the earlier Black press, there was I was looking at some of those things and I was like, I don't know, you guys are centering yourselves too much. Where are the other experiences here? But that's another conversation for another day. And of course,
Yeah.
it was a lot of men there, and I was like, were there no women in the 1900s? I don't know what's happening, but okay. Um, but it was interesting to see all of this stuff formalized in that way. And of course, working on an archive project means that it will live forever. You can literally go on the National Library of South Africa and you can access all of those newspapers from back in the day.
Oh,
And
wow.
they will show you all of the things and how people were living. You get to experience essentially how life was, and how educated Black people were were entering that emerging middle class during colonization. And you're sort of starting to, you can even make now the comparisons of, oh, okay, this was life pre-apartheid and this is how life became post-apartheid, and all of these things,
Mm.
the Jabavus, just that whole family in terms of like education and being really the foundational block for, education for Black people. And so all of those things exist in those newspapers, and you can access them for free on the National Library of South Africa website. And I said, okay, I want to do this for television. And so that's how I sort of come into that specific 50 years of television in South Africa project, because it came in at a time as I was also sort of starting to sort of try and figure out, how do I formalize this conversation in terms of how we talk about media, how we talk about culture, how we talk about our music. And because for me, it's not only television, it's only, I just spent a lot of more time looking at television, but I talk about music, I talk about other different forms of mediums. I mean, the 2010s alone for me is a whole, and that's more special because I 2010s is when I was a bit older, so I knew, I was conscious, and I have
You were
all the life.
seeing things.
Yes, like the 90s and the 2000s. When I talk about Home Affairs, it's mostly nostalgia, but obviously with a little bit of that information. But I think the 2010s, when I talk about Nontle Goes to Hollywood, I was fully alive.
You were watching it.
I was there. So, and what
Yeah.
that meant for me watching that, right? So yeah, so 50 years of television in South Africa is really just exploring how South African television has never been neutral from its birth. It's always
Mm.
been political, it's always been curated and shaped by power. And so I sort of look at different areas. I start off the chapter looking at apartheid era television, and in fact that, because it doesn't make sense that we are the last country to even have television.
Television. Mm.
It was delayed, and of course, I talk about how that was intentional, because of the apartheid government. And then when it did arrive, it was racially segregated, language controlled, heavily censored, of course, and Black audiences were managed and not served, really.
Mm.
And so, of course, what does that mean for representation in a TV broadcasting landscape that is new, where Black audiences are not necessarily served, but they are just there for aesthetics, right? And just for vibes, as the kids would say. So, and then I sort of start going into the early democratic era, which is obviously the 90s, early 2000s. And that's really where I ground a lot of the chapter, where I talk about this golden era that's really centered on all different types of stories of South Africans, and marginalized lives, working class, and also just how the SABC treated television as a tool. And again, going back to what I mentioned earlier on about nation building, that it was not just entertainment, but there was an interest and intentional effort to also create a dialogue, because I do believe, like,
Mm.
vision at that time was also a dialogue between the audience and what was happening in the country. But most importantly, if you notice, and I'll leave it here for now because I've been going on, television was more proactive than reactive. So it
Sure.
didn't react to times, which is what we're seeing a lot of the time. So when you mention some of the shows that are on these platforms, there's a lot, and I mean I don't hate it, but I'm not really a fan of. Um,
Mm.
there tends to be a lot of, for instance, when I watch Blood and Water and when I watch things like Youngins, there tends to also be a lot of you sort of reacting to trending moments on Twitter, and then you translate that into storytelling, and that does have a place, but that can't be the whole story, right?
Mm.
Around that. So, for instance, on Yuzo Yuzo, they created culture. So yes, some of the stories reflected what was happening in township high schools, but also there was a great balance of creating culture and curating ways of seeing ourselves. Because whilst they were looking, especially for me, Yuzo Yuzo 3 was really then the most proactive out of that trilogy, because then on User 3 you sort of are now creating language around what does it mean, first of all, to leave the township and go live
Mm.
in Johannesburg city and be in university. That story had never
Mm.
television. And so again, what does it mean to navigate queerness and masculinities when you are operating within a hyper masculine space? What does that look like? That story had never been, we'd never seen it before on television. In fact, we would not see it for quite a while, and I don't think we have actually seen it even on contemporary television, because by
No.
the time After Nine comes, After Nine was also again middle class. So
Mm.
had a queer black man who was in corporate and who was sort of navigating both these queer black men. They were navigating their queerness within black middle classness, and of course that comes with a certain level of safety. But Yuzo Yuzo was showing us the dangers of even being queer within a hyper masculine space, and what does that mean? And it gave us language. People might have been laughing, people might have found it to be, oh, you promoting, queerness and all of these other things. But I do think it started a dialogue. And so that's why it was important for me to be a part of this project. And a lot of what my chapter really does is sort of ask this question about, the way TV was raising consciousness intentionally. And so again, asking, what does the country need to talk about right now, right? Because there was a moment where television understood itself as a part of nation building, not just nation branding.
Okay. I'm so sorry. I got a little bit distracted there. We'll cut that part out. But just so that I get back to my train of thought, I think archiving is so important because it helps us reflect and see what was back then.
Yeah,
I'm like a new member to the South African Libraries. Uh, what's this? I just signed up, so I go to the library to get my books and stuff. But I
yeah,
haven't really explored the digital archives. I'm not there yet. And
yeah.
so before we continue this conversation, I just want to backtrack there, and I want to know what were your findings when you read up like on, I just am forgetting the name of the newspaper, but the one that was established by what's this Me Charlotte Maxeke and her husband.
With that, I think that was the school. I'm not sure if
Was
that
it a
was.
school? No, weren't they also writing about I don't know if it was newspaper Bantu or something like that.
There's Umthetheleli Wabantu, Umthetheleli
Yes.
Wabantu, which was one of the Black Press newspapers. So there's quite a few of them.
Mm-hmm.
And there is also what do you call Bantu World. I think maybe you talk about Bantu World.
Maybe I don't know, but also I read about this when I was doing research on Mere Charlotte Maxeke, which is also not as expensive as it should be. But I think that's also why it's so important that we are able to go back and say that. This is what we did, because even when black people were so censored in the makings of television before the 90s, I think there was still a depth to the storytelling. When you look
Yes.
at Lisilo, when you look at Kwakhala
Clocker.
kwenyoni.
Yes.
My my tongue does not bend that way, but all of those. Oh, Aphiwe, I'm so sorry. Can we
No.
just pause there? My next guest is calling me, and so I'm not.
Oh, I see. No problem.
Yes. Okay, she said she's on. Oh, let me just put this phone on silent because Zbu went out to fetch her now. Because now I'm gonna be distracted. Okay. Whew, to get back on track. There was just so much depth in the old stories that we still don't see now. And I love when you talk about creating culture because I think that's what television has always been. You know,
Yeah.
like even like your MTVs. And how I always say this when I listen to like the old Afro beats, like MTV base actually connected Africa. Like
It did.
they connected Africa because if it weren't for MTV base, I wouldn't know who P Square was. Who Oh, now it's David O. I always called him Davido, but hey. I wouldn't know who Debanj was, and we wouldn't be as connected to Thames, to Ira Star, if it weren't for platforms like MTV Base. And now that all of that is falling away, and there's this rising of reality television that also does not bring us together. You know, I'm forced to say then what, at this point as we stand right now, what is the purpose of media? It seems as if we're in a attention economy, so all you want is our attention, but you're not teaching us anything, you're not showing us anything of significance. In fact, a lot of it is like, if you look, it's so scary that we're even mentioning the shows, but if you look at Young, Famous and African, Awa, what are you working? What are you doing? It's just people meeting up and fighting. There isn't that. They're not telling the world what it is to be African and to pursue a rap career, to pursue a music career, to be a business person, to be a jet setting African, because that matters because of how it's so difficult to travel the continent. Just in just that story itself is a very, I think, is a very powerful story that we should be seeing on television, but we don't. So at this point, okay, I want to know firstly, maybe should I ask what the purpose of media first is, and then we'll talk about how then do we use our imagination to pave a new way? What should be that isn't right now?
Yeah. I mean, we can start on the purpose, right? Because I think that builds the foundation of how we understand how all of this works, and how it's produced and directed, and the intentions behind each and every piece of media that comes out. And you'll remember earlier on, I spoke about, you know, the reason why middle class blackness on television is often presented as aspirational, respectable, and all of those other things I mentioned earlier, is that it makes it easier for broadcasters and advertisers. But obviously, it comes at the cost of sidelining, consciousness raising and all of the other good stuff that television historically has meant, at the very least, when it comes to the South African landscape. So I also want to invite the listener to also think about the economics of it all, right? Because as TV is changing and evolving, the economies behind broadcasting also change, right? And the formats change, and they're becoming obviously expensive sometimes. And obviously, they're also becoming more accessible. So I think with the rise of platforms like TikTok, and it's what I've been sort of interested in. I don't know when I'm writing this paper because I have a lot of papers in my head, but the emergence of narrowcasting, which is podcasting, vlogs, all of this, fourth industrial revolution, these products that have come with this, industrial revolution has meant that also traditional television has had to sort of think about creative ways of making sure that people don't entirely migrate from watching TV, right? Because again, TV is not only just competing with the small devices, which is the phones, but it's also competing with streaming, right? And so, what does that also mean? Because streaming is not necessarily linear television, because you can literally stream anywhere. And so, what does that mean for public broadcasters like the SABC? And that's one question when you sort of trying to figure out, or at least to start, you get it to start the listener to get them to think about what is happening behind the scenes and what are some of the questions that are being asked. Because when you think about it from a technical point of view, competition is very rife, right? And
Mm.
making it difficult for them to then sort of also create stories that are not going to, in their minds, not be watched. And here's the thing also, because as you mentioned, we are living in an era of attention economy. Oftentimes people are becoming, or oftentimes people find themselves on these other, platforms, like your TikToks, like your Instagrams, and all of these places that are producing content. And so what happens is you then watch a podcast that's unfiltered, that's raw, and you almost then, by the time you come back to the format of packaged media storytelling, it doesn't really, resonate with you.
Mm-hmm.
You then are seeing that, oh no, this is, I just watched the same interview. Let's say if you're watching an interview about, I don't know, some Hollywood star or South African star. And let's say you're watching Bonang on a podcast and then you're watching her on SABC One. You can almost tell that there's a difference, right? In
Yeah.
how the story looks like and how it's packaged and so already on just the packaging and the format alone, you've already kind of created this feeling that this side is more, I don't want something packaged, I want something raw because I want the stories and I want to hear the full story. And then you also remember that traditional television also is competing with advertisers. So the space is really, there isn't time to have a blabbering Aphiwe who can blabber for an hour without cutting. And of course, the conversation will be cut, but not in the way that if this conversation was happening on SABC One, where one, I would probably only have 15 minutes to cover
Yeah.
what we're just talking about, right? And then when you really think about it, even with entertainment journalism like Real Goboza, where you would expect to at least have a segment that is an hour, but you would have a celebrity sit there for like literally 2 minutes and you are really interested in whatever it is that they're working on, but you're only getting 2 minutes of what they're bringing. So there's that. And then in the attention economy, also, once you lose me, the chances of you getting me back
Very
becomes
slim.
very difficult, right? And so, again, and I haven't even touched on the fact that our attention spans are also getting quite
Yo.
smaller and smaller.
We are so cooked.
So then, you find yourself that you're battling with a lot of other little issues that don't necessarily speak to the infrastructure as much. It's just more so of how do we consume. So because just on consumption alone, already a lot has changed. So what does that mean for television? And I think when we ask the question about, how do we think about the purpose of media today, I think it's a lot of things. I think
Mm.
it's quite a lot of things. And I think because we have so many things moving, it's such a big, huge machine, it makes it difficult to really just reduce it to one thing. So I think for me, media and what its purpose is for today, of course, the primary one is to tell stories. But I think the more we complicate that answer in terms of, okay, when we say tell stories, what does that mean? The more you
Mm.
complicate it, the more you realize that there's quite a lot to talk about just within that. The purpose is to tell stories. So I think for me, my view is that I think we just need to start reimagine we should start reimagining how we define media for ourselves, because I think that will then sort of start a conversation in terms of where do you want to consume media and how do you want to consume media, right? Because it's changing, and of course
Mm.
change, we can't necessarily, I don't think we can get to a place where we can almost agree 100% in terms of how television should look like. And I mean, as I mentioned, the current chapter that I'm working on, I was just presenting now, and I mean, there was quite a lot of things that came up just about Netflix alone in terms of, well, we can't expect Netflix to these are some of the sentiments that we can't expect Netflix to hold South African stories in the way that we would like to see the
That's very true.
and the question becomes why, and I think you mentioned it, private owned, right? Um,
Mm,
they're really doing us a favor, well, quote unquote. Um, and so of course, once we talk about streaming, which is another new way of telling stories, already there we're talking platform logics, we're talking export logics, which I've been talking about throughout this conversation. And those are
mm,
things that I want the listener to also sort of start thinking about, because I don't think a lot of that technical language filters down into the everyday conversation. Because once you start understanding, platform logics and export logics versus local logics and versus local public logics, you start to then realize that, oh, the reason why Blood and Water looks like this is because it needs to fit the narrative of how Hollywood thinks about this kind of setting. And of course, now and again, you have storylines that are more, that feel, or the texture of them are more South African. But at the end of the day, the whole product has to be a kind of universal product and not one
mm.
product. So that's on purpose. It's a messy answer. It's not a definitive answer, but I think it's a start. So I think it's, for me, the purpose of media is really about redefining how we think about story, how we think about, how storytelling looks like in South Africa at the moment. I think the primary, purpose of media is to tell stories and hopefully to tell authentic stories. But that's a hope, right? So what does that
Yeah.
mean in this economy? What does that look like? And then I think that's where we can start encouraging the public to also invest in some of these platforms that don't necessarily get a lot of, eyeballs or ears. Because we're
Mm.
not talking about, we need more, authentic stories, but only one story gets
The investment
or
and
goes viral,
attention.
right? What does that mean in terms of our consumption? I was talking about, you probably saw it, just not so long ago, about the real globalification of hip hop media, right?
Yes.
And
I love that.
already the issue can't just be the aren't platforms. There are platforms where people are engaging hip hop critically, but people are just not because it's boring. You want to go to a podcast
Mm.
that's going to give you a viral moment, that's going to give you the hot tea for the week, and that's going to start beef, or that's going to, and there is a place. So again, we need to appreciate that there's a place for that. There's a place for Young Famous African. What is that, the name of the show? There's a place for that show. But
Yes.
also it needs to be balanced with another show that looks,
Yeah.
I don't know if you remember on SABC when Precious Coffee was doing that the Pan African show where she was visiting the different countries on the continent and just the experience. You want to have that balance, but of course on a platform, because platform logics would dictate that, well, no one really cares about what's organically and what's happening in Kenya and like what's emerging there. So I want to see fighting. And so when by the time we talk Real Housewives go, what's that one? Girls Trip. By the time we talk Girls Trip, if I'm bringing someone from Kenya, I'm gonna bring drama, and so again, it's looking for that virality because it makes more money, it brings more clicks, clickbait. So you really want to think about how do we balance the storytelling. So yes, the primary answer is that it's about storytelling, but where do these stories live? How do you train yourself as a consumer to actually go and invest in the stories that you want to see? Because sometimes I do feel that as consumers, we can be tad bit lazy in terms of actually doing the research of where the stories are, because sometimes the stories are there. As I was saying now, if you
Yeah.
the National Library of South Africa, all the catalogs are there. Umthetheleli wabantu, that's where Charlotte Maxage was contributing. So that
Yes.
world, the stories are there. You get to learn the history of Black lives in those times, right? And it's
Mm.
always fascinating, right? For you to even have just a little bit of window in what were Black people doing in 1932
Sure.
in South Africa, and the
Mm.
stories that you're gonna get from there, right? I mean, the headline of that specific that's coming to mind, it's building a great Bantu city,
Whew.
plans homes for natives, all of these other things. Orlando Township will provide housing, and that's where we come from. Those are the stories that make us who we are. So there is access, and yes, sometimes, I also say that the marketing sometimes is not there. to make this accessible, because again, the
Yeah.
issue with South Africa is that not everyone is online. That's another conversation for another day, Lord.
Yo.
But
One that we need to get into at some point, because we are, I think, as what's upwardly mobile South
yes,
Africans, the Twitter generation, we think that what everyone is saying on Twitter is
yeah,
what South Africa is like. And I find that it is such a small world on Twitter, and South Africa is so much bigger than what we make it seem. Um, Aphiwe, we're going to come to a time when, which is what I really want to encourage through this platform, and that is the one of imagination.
yes.
Okay, using for people to use their imagination to create a future, because I do feel like we're so, what's the word? We're submissive. We just consumers, consumers, consumers. We complain, oh, why aren't they doing this? No, 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 no. So if you were to use your imagination to come up with a solution, what would it be? Because I think, okay, just to figure my thoughts in the UK, your imagination can take you somewhere else. But I think our solution is really based on that nation building thing. And hey, I believe in the SABC, and not the people, but it as an entity and what it could do for South African media as a whole.
Mm.
Woo! Mudim. But Aphiwe, what do you think a solution could be? If you could fashion a solution from your imagination, what do you think we need?
Look, the solution, as I was rambling about the purpose, it's
Mm,
again, it's messy, it has chaos, but good chaos, organized chaos, if such a thing exists. So I think for me, my solution would be reflecting the times and the people, right?
mm,
And the responsibility to challenge and innovate and not just mirror, right? Um, because I think when you're able to reflect the times and the people, when you're able to innovate, and when you're able to challenge, that's where a lot of the creativity and a lot of the nuance and a lot of the full lived experience and authentic stories are born, right?
mm-hmm.
And I think combining those three things and really investing in making sure that you are able to reflect the people, the times, and you're able to responsibly challenge, you are able to also to go against the grain sometimes and
Yeah.
start conversations, because I think when you challenge, you plant seeds, right? You plant seeds for conversation, you plant seeds for questioning. I think when you think about home affairs, I've spent a lot of time studying home affairs in and out. um, I don't think that show today and then would have been commissioned if someone wasn't willing to take a risk. And I say that because we know how Black women are seen, in,
Mm,
right? We know how Black women are treated in society. We know how women in general are seen in society. There's no place for women. And I mean, the idea of even having a woman led, I remember when Austin Tati was talking about even the behind the scenes of Home Affairs, it's women.
mm,
Um, we haven't seen anything like that again, which tells you that there's a problem somewhere. But
mm,
what I'm trying to make is that Home Affairs was interested in reflecting the times, the women of South Africa, and it responsibly challenged how women are seen. So it just didn't mirror the stories that are happening on the ground. There was a place for mirroring, but there was also a place to tell new stories and also to introduce new layers and to complicate Black women on the television screen. Society did the same thing, another woman led
oh,
show.
left it down.
For the first time, we saw a Black lesbian, a woman on television. What did that mean? And it wasn't just a Black lesbian woman, but she was complicated. She was
Mm,
acting with these ideas of femininity, and Beth's storyline grew with us on television. We were able to empathize. And even if you didn't agree, but you were able to empathize because she was made human. So you went beyond just the sexuality and the identity, but you went to the humanness. And I think that's where we are able to really, I suppose, engage with our humanness when stories again reflect the times, the people, and responsibly challenge, the times, and not just mirror, because it could have easily just played on stereotypes and left
True.
it at that, right? And not really create room for conversation. So I hear you when you talk about, the solution, and it is, by the way, my solution as well. I do believe that that nation building formula worked and that there was no reason for it to be let go. Um, but to complicate it a little bit more, for me, it's about taking the risk. It's about political urgency. It's about storytelling from below the middle class, outside urban professional life, beyond respectability, politics, not just what will trend, but what conversations are we avoiding? And after lying about
Mm.
that, right, we were avoiding the conversation that there were Black men who were married with kids who were queer.
Mm.
They were queer because there was no space for them. And what does that mean for a society that produces men to suppress so much of emotion? What does
Mm.
that mean for Black masculinity? Of course, we're seeing it much more. We're seeing it much later. Um, with the femicide that's happening in South Africa, because Black men suppress a lot of emotions because there hasn't been space, and that's a product of patriarchy. But we're not talking,
Mm.
right? And again, with music, it was important for Dumi to release Power in 2011 when Akona's story went viral in South Africa, and that was like the first time where a young girl, Black girl, Black woman rather, because she wasn't a girl, was sexually assaulted, and it went as far as hip hop.
Hmm.
And it was important again. That was media doing what Dumi was doing there. He was reflecting the times and also challenging men, other men. All those men who were rapping there, they were rapping about sexual assault.
Mm.
And of course, I can imagine how uncomfortable that is, because they probably have encountered, friends who've done this thing if they've not done it themselves.
Yeah.
And so again, it was uncomfortable. Probably not going to trend, but it's going to start. It's going to start a conversation. Nontle Goes to Hollywood started a conversation about the possibilities of being a young Black woman in the 2010s who was, innovative and who was ambitious enough to chase her dreams. And for me, that was the template. If Nontle could make it to Hollywood, I can also do this, and it planted that seed. So even when you were saying earlier on that SABC as an institution raised a lot of us, and it
Mm.
planted a lot of seeds of aspiration, and it planted a lot of seeds of just having the will to chase our dreams. It is that. So my solution is to think about that. Think about the fact that media is supposed to reflect the times and the people, but also it has the responsibility to challenge power and not just mirror aspiration. I think once we move away from what will trend, we can then go back to producing stories like Soul City, like Soul Buddies,
Eish.
because again, the the issue here is not just about, oh, there's just like these random stories that are coming, but it's about also, do these stories matter,
Hey.
right? So for me, if television only reflects who we're trying to become and never who we actually are,
Uh.
it stops being a mirror and becomes propaganda.
Ooh. That's a bar. That is a bar. Aphiwe, thank you so much.
Thank you
This
for
was
bringing.
such an insightful conversation. Like you let me tell you, we're in the SABC building right now. But I think it's very important that this conversation echoes. Maybe the ghosts will do something.
Hopefully they will do something.
Because
Thank
I really do. For me, actually, I did a TikTok on this last year to say
you.
that nation building is really, hey, it's the jackpot. It's the jackpot,
It is.
and also through our conversation, I'm just hearing employment, 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 employment. The employment of people to archive, the employment of people to of researchers, and all
Yes.
these professions that now have come to seem as if they're not relevant, but it's so important.
And
Okay.
Shaka Ilembe is an example of great television when people are interested in researchers, cultural curators, and all of
Mm.
product like that. Queen Mujaji, I can even go back to the 2000s with Death of a Queen. There was
Yeah.
consulting there, and I mean that's my next project. I'm looking at the transmission, the cultural transmission of Death of a Queen in terms of Sepedi media and what that meant. And when our Shogi talks about it, you can see that there was a lot of consulting in terms of what does this mean culturally. Now, of course, as a parting word, I'm also, because oftentimes people try to catch me, because Twitter, they'll try their gotcha politics.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also not what's the word? It's not lost on me that those stories were also through the lens of white people, because most of the directors,
Mm.
producers, because it was the late 90s into the early 2000s. So some of those stories were shot by white people who probably didn't even know. I mean, even Alshoki says the director, when she does that very famous scene that used to come across SABC all the time, even the directors, because she was like, at that point she had transcended into another world, but the directors were like, oh, that's just perfect for TV. For them it was just that. Obviously for us it had a cultural, there was a cultural, there were cultural underlining things that were happening in that moment that went beyond.
Mm.
There was almost like this cultural trigger that happened in that moment. So it's not lost on me that also those stories, some of those stories, if not most of them, were told through a very specific lens, but there was consultation that happened, which
Yeah.
to me was very important. Commissioning editors were also part and parcel of that story. And to me, that's very important. And I think it's what you're saying, that once you invest in the researchers, in the writers and all of these things, you're able to produce diverse stories that can speak to the nation.
Yeah. And also at the end of the day with the SABC, like profit is not the goal. So who cares? Who
What is
cares?
happening, really?
Just invest, 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 invest. The money will come.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Aphiwe. Literally, like you are such a wonder. I think the work that you're doing is so important, and I hope one day you get to even open up a museum of some sort, because we need to be able to take our future children, or the future children of this country and the world, through those days, and for
Right.
them to experience it in like an institution like a museum. I think it's very, very important.
Thank you so much, Claudia, for having me.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, what an insightful conversation with our guest, Aphiwe Mame. You can follow her on all platforms as Aphiwe, Mame, because that's where I found her. But I think it is very important that we interrogate the media that we consume and actually become creators of media that we want to see, because it's not enough to complain at this point in time. What are you doing, my friend? What are you doing to make your world better? And I guess that's the big question of the Ellipsis podcast. What are you doing to make yourself better? I'm so happy that you guys tuned in for this episode. Please like, share, subscribe, comment on all platforms. We are on Spotify, Instagram, and YouTube as the Ellipsis Podcast. And then you can follow me, Lerato Mugere, or Radical Self Lerato on all platforms. Yeah. See you in the next episode.